Hello there. I'm Steve Cole, the pastor of the First Methodist Church in Oswego, Kansas, and the West Mineral Church in West Mineral, Kansas. And today we're going to be looking at a sermon from Matthew 11, verses 28 to 30. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." May God add a blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of His Word. You know, they tell us in life there are only a couple things we really need to worry about. Whether we're going to get sick or we're going to get better. Well, if we get better, we've got nothing to worry about. If we get sick, then we've got a couple things to worry about. Are we going to get better or are we going to get worse? Well, if we get better, nothing to worry about. If we get worse, got a couple things to worry about. Are we going to live or are we going to die? Well, if we live, we got nothing to worry about. If we die, we're going to go to heaven. Why worry about that? So, in essence, we have nothing to worry about. But yet we do. And yet we do. Oh, you know, this passage that I've read several times at funeral services, especially for someone that's really not part of the church or doesn't really have as far as I know, some kind of faith. And so, you know, to make it palatable, I guess, is to say they are entered into their time of rest. I don't want to say one thing too far one way or the other, so that they have entered into their time of rest, that Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." Well, just about everybody has some kind of burden that they're dealing with, and Jesus can help with those things. You know, and I can imagine that what Jesus said here at that time, first century, means a little bit different than it would to us today. Because the people at that time, life was a struggle. First century, just about everything that they did involved hard physical labor. From preparing a meal, having to get the food around, they didn't have any place to store it, so they might have to go to the market or go out in the garden to get a fire ready, to put a fire together so they could cook the food, and then put it all together to wash dishes. Again, you've got to have heat to heat the water. You've got to go get the water somewhere. You didn't just go to a tap and get it. They had to go to a well or the river or whatever, get the water, heat it up, get it ready to go. Same thing with, washing clothes. That was not an easy task. You had to get the water, heat it up, go through the process of, wringing the clothes out, brushing them, and then hanging them up to dry. And of course, with the crops, or even the livestock for that matter. But putting in something like wheat, you had to plow the field either do it by hand with a hoe, or have an ox that pulled a plow and walk behind it, physically throw out the wheat seed. Then when it was gathered together, they had to cut it down, put it together in shocks, take it, beat it, get the wheat seeds to come out, separate the straw, and then to get the chaff out of the wheat, they had to throw it up in the air so that the wind would blow the chaff away. Harvesting wheat was a major, highly labor-intensive thing to do. And of course, caring for animals, the same thing too. It's just highly labor-intensive. All these things that they had to go through. And then, of course, even if you did get wheat, to use it, you had to grind it up into flour, which meant you had to find some way to grind it up. It was definitely very labor-intensive. And so for the people at that time, having some time to rest was a precious thing indeed. That they didn't get much time to rest. The only time you rested was probably when you went to sleep at night. That was about it. They didn't have times that they could just lounge around and take it easy. There was always something to do. And that might be part of the reason why the lifespan back there wasn't much longer than 40 years. People just didn't live as long. Their body, either they got sick and had something, had an accident, or their bodies just wore out by that time. Now, things weren't that much different for my grandparents' generation, which wasn't, in aspect of time, not all that much different 100 years ago or so. My grandparents on my mother's side got married in 1929. What happened in 1929? The stock market crashed. The Depression hit. And they had to be there on the farm raising their family during the Depression. And life was not all that easy then either. They had horses to help with the field, but this was before the tractors came along, and life on the farm was pretty labor intensive. Now, they did have plenty of food. They had a garden. They had cattle and pigs, chickens. They had food, but not much else. And again, life was very labor intensive, and having a time to rest, again, was not something that you had every day. It was a precious thing. Now, today, things are a little bit different for us. We don't have quite as much labor-intensive type things that we do. Well, there's a few, but not like it was like in my grandparents' time period. We have lots of things to help us, like washing clothes is so much easier. We throw something in the washer, we throw it in the dryer, it's done. Back then they had to, again, heat the water up, put it in. They might have had a wringer washer, but they still had to maybe had a washboard and hang the clothes up on to dry on the line. It was a highly, and again, even bringing in the hay from the field was quite a labor-intensive thing that they didn't have balers to bale it up. They had to do it all loose, and so pitchfork and had a little bit of equipment, horse-drawing equipment, but still highly labor-intensive. Today we've got tractors and hay balers that bale it up, and even they put it in the big round bales, and they use the tractor or the truck to get a hold of it. And, hey, much less labor-intensive than it would have been. And like I say, example of wheat, well, you plant it with a tractor, you harvest it with a combine, put it in the truck. It still takes a lot of work, but not as labor intensive as it would have been. And so for us, rest is something that we enjoy a lot more. That we have times of rest, that we can do other things, but we take that time of rest and oftentimes fill it with activities. And so do we really just sit and rest? Yeah, maybe sometimes. But we find other things to occupy ourselves with. And so hopefully it's things that we enjoy doing, that even though it's something we may not be resting from the standpoint that we're just doing that and nothing else, we are doing things we enjoy. So, Jesus, being a carpenter, made several different things, and we kind of, back at that time, we kind of think Jesus, we think of carpenters as being people that build houses and buildings and things like that. But back at that time in that part of the world, the wood was not readily available, and so a carpenter might have done other things besides work with wood, or if they did work with wood, they didn't make necessarily an entire home. They might make a door, a table, and chairs, or another thing, a yoke that would go on an oxen. Now, those things that went over the top of them, that they could use it to pull a cart or a plow, and that would be used in a way that it could help the oxen do the work. But told that Jesus being a carpenter, he says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm humble and gentle in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls." And the idea being that the yoke that he might have made for oxen out of wood would have been custom made for each oxen that it would be using it, so that it fit just right to make the work easier. So that kind of makes this passage kind of make a little more sense that way. Because he says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. How about that? I think that there's a possibility that Jesus uses that as a metaphor that the people at that time would have had a better understanding of. Now, we as Christians don't totally have a burden-free life. We have things that, challenge us, and our faith does make it easier, as Jesus said. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. Doesn't mean that the burdens are totally gone. It just means that they're maybe lighter than they would be if we didn't have faith, if Jesus wasn't helping us with these things. We give these things over to Jesus. And there's a song that we sing that says, take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. Right? The name of the song is Leave It There. Physical labor is not the only kind of burden we sometimes might have either. There's the Jewish people, and thinking too about this particular time that Jesus is talking about. They had the law that they had to follow. Well, that was kind of a burden because you had to eat the right foods, wear the right clothes, do the right activities. You couldn't work on the Sabbath, or there was only certain things you could do on the Sabbath. And then you had to bring offerings of different types, all kinds of different rules and regulations that you had to follow. And that was kind of a burden. And yet Jesus comes along and he says, to love God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And said, if you do that, you fulfilled the law. Made it a lot easier to be able to do those things. And for us, burdens come in lots of different kinds of forms. We can have physical problems, like health issues. We can have financial problems. We can have emotional problems. Or we can have problems with relationships. There's all kinds of different things that might be a burden to us. And if we look back at that song, Leave It There, it kind of hints at some of these things. The first verse says, if the world from you withhold its silver and its gold, and you have to get along with meager fare, right? And all of us at one time or another have been there, where we've had to get along with meager fare, that we're not promised we're going to be healthy, wealthy, and prosperous, but He'll be with us as we go through this life, and we can endure those things. So, yes, we know that God provides for our needs, not necessarily our wants. So, yeah. I've been there. That old TV commercial where the guy says, I'm in debt up to my eyeballs. Been there, done that. And I thought at one time, oh, wow, am I ever going to get out of debt? But over time, persevering, and we made it. We are no longer in debt, and so we're glad for that. The second verse of the song says, if your body suffers pain and your health you can't regain and your soul is almost sinking in despair, Jesus knows the pain you feel. He can save and He can heal. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there, right? Yeah, we're all going to have at one time or another physical ailments, and help us. That Jesus helps us as we go through those things. He doesn't necessarily take it away from us, but helps us as we go through that. Now, myself, I've been, for the most part, so far in my life, fairly healthy. I've been able to get that. So I, haven't had too much trouble, but there are many people that have health problems. And like I say, again, He doesn't take those things away, but helps us as we go through those times, that we can look to God to help us through that. And then some of us can relate to the last verse of the song. It says, when your youthful days are done and your old age is stealing on, and your body bends beneath the load of care, He will never leave you then. He'll go with you to the end. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. I can relate to that one. In my head, I'm still 40 years old. But my body always tells me every once in a while, no, you're not. I can't quite do things the way I did when I was 40. But, it's good to, no matter what, we can still pray, we can still praise God. That even though we might not be able to do all the physical things that we did before, and it says Jesus is there with us. And then there are emotional burdens that people face. We seem to be more willing to talk about those things these days than we may have in the past. People might say, "Oh, just let it go," or as the song says, "Leave it there." Right? Take it your burden to the Lord and leave it there. It's easy to say that to somebody, but it's not always easy for them to do. We can try and do that, but sometimes, there's people do have emotional problems of anxiety and depression, and Lord, our faith can help. But there are times when we need a little bit more than that. Maybe somebody to talk to, maybe medication, whatever. That along with looking for the Lord to help us as we go through that those things are important. Unfortunately for me, I've been one of those people that's kind of happy-go-lucky and easygoing. Don't worry about things too much. As Alfred D. Newman said in Mad Magazine, "What, me worry?" I'm not a worrier, but, who knows? We know that even though we go through that, the Lord's with us as we go through those things. There's a passage there out of 2 Corinthians that Paul talks about having a thorn in his flesh. He wanted to have 3 times he prayed to have this thorn in his flesh removed, but he was told, "My grace is sufficient for you." That even the Apostle Paul dealt with, and we really don't know what that thorn in the flesh was. We don't have those details, but still, he knew that it was something he had to live with. But even so, he still knew that God's grace would help him through that. Then there's a passage in Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. It says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God that surpasses all understanding will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." That's one of my favorite passages in the Bible. It says, "By everything with prayer and supplication with thanksgiving." Wow. "And the peace of God which surpasses all understanding." A lot of times we don't know how we can get through these things, but God's peace is there for us if we go to Him in prayer and ask, and will help us as we go through the things in life. But I also think this passage, in a way, speaks about going to heaven. And the idea being, he says, "Take my yoke upon you, my burden is easy and light." That we think that when we go to heaven, what are we going to do? Well, I don't know. I doubt, I really don't think we're going to be sitting on a cloud, playing a harp and singing hymns. That just doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun to me. But I like to think that there's going to be something that we're going to do. But as he said, "My burden is easy and my yoke is light." Right? That we'll have things to do, but things we enjoy, things that are fun. And that's what we can look forward to, that the Lord has something for us in that way. Well, thank you for coming. I hope that this may have been a blessing to you, and that we can look to the Lord knowing that He indeed loves us and cares for us. So now may we go knowing that God goes with us to guide us, lead us, and help us today and every day. Amen.